In August of 1990, Danny Rolling would go on a killing spree that lasted only several days, and yet still left lasting scars on the Gainesville community. Rolling's crimes were so terrifying and violent, he served as the inspiration for Kevin Williamson to write the Scream movies, represented by Ghostface. Today, join in as we learn all about Rolling and his crimes, and try to learn what, if anything, could have been done to stop him from committing these terrible acts. Today's case is a little different, as we normally cover killers who manage to stay undetected for long periods of time. Instead, we're going to cover everything that led up to the murders, and what failures were there along the way that kept Danny Rolling a free man for as long as he was. This is the case of the Gainesville Ripper. As always, let's start our story with the background of our subject, Danny Rolling. Rolling was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, to mother and father Claudia and James Rolling. Rolling's father was a police officer, and numerous sources would say that he was terribly abusive to James from a very early age. In one story, James first beat his son for crawling the wrong way as a 1-year-old child. James Rolling would allegedly routinely beat his son, until Rolling's younger brother Kevin was born, at which time Kevin would then share in this abuse. By all accounts, Rolling, his brother, and mother had a very rough life. He would be held back in the 3rd grade for missing too much school, and this would result in a nervous breakdown for Claudia. When Rollings was 9, he had a young puppy that his father reported he was very close to. One day after school, he came home and could not find him, asking his father who would lead him out to a grave, showing a young Danny that he had just killed the puppy. A few years later, just after turning 11, a young Danny would begin to dabble in drugs and alcohol, while learning to express himself through singing and guitar. During this time of his youth, Rolling claims that he would walk around his neighborhood at night, when most children were home with their families eating dinner. It was during this time that he would watch families through their windows as they sat down and ate. To Rollings, they appeared so normal and happy, and this would ultimately lead to his anger, as he would begin to wonder why he didn't have a family life like that. At the age of 14, this window watching would take a darker turn, and Rollings would eventually be busted watching a neighbor dress after exiting the shower. Once his father was informed, it would lead to another severe beating. Rollings' childhood consisted of abuse, drugs and alcohol, and being the neighborhood peeping Tom. He and his brother would be allegedly beaten, handcuffed, and even arrested by their father on several occasions. Ultimately, in 1971, when he was just 17, Rollings dropped out of high school and got his GED before enlisting in the Air Force. Rollings would serve in the Air Force for 2 years, where he would claim to use acid over 100 times, as well as other drugs while drinking heavily. This would continue until Rollings was discharged from the military. Rollings would later meet his wife, Omather Halko, at the King's Temple United Pentecostal Church, in his hometown of Shreveport. The marriage would last only 3 years, as Rollings would continue the cycle of abuse, culminating in him allegedly holding a gun to his wife's head. Halko would take their young daughter and flee, getting a divorce in 1977. After this, Rollings' life really takes a downward spiral. He would drift from job to job and place to place. Rollings goes on to sexually assault a woman who resembled his wife, which would not become known until after he was arrested for the murders. So now that we've got some of the background out of the way, we're going to start going over Rollings' arrest history as well as we can. While I did manage to get the records of his crimes and arrests via public records requests from the Gainesville Police Department, there was no confirmed arrest history. The best I was able to find was a paper timeline made by Radford University's Department of Psychology. I'll credit the contributors here, and going forward, this is what we'll be using to summarize Rollings' interactions with police and courts prior to his string of murders, trying to identify if he could or should have been stopped sooner. Rollings' first actual arrests occurred when he was in the military, for drug possession and insubordination. This is what would lead to his discharge. Rollings' next encounter with police was in 1976 when he was caught peeping into a woman's window and was brought back home by the officer, who informed Rollings' wife of what he was doing. During this time, it was alleged that Rollings was hallucinating, seeing ghosts, angels, and demons. It is unknown if he was treated for any mental illness during this time. Despite the above aggravated assault where Rollings held a gun to his wife's head and threatened to kill her, it was never reported to the police and no charges were pressed. This is a time where Danny could have been arrested and possibly locked up, but like most domestic disputes, this went unreported and unpunished. In 1978, at 24 years old, Rollings began to date a 17-year-old and began to commit numerous robberies. Here is where we're really going to see his life of crime take off. On May 25th of 1979, he robbed a Winn-Dixie in Montgomery, Alabama for $800. On May 31st, 1979, he robbed another Winn-Dixie in Columbus, Georgia, after which he would be arrested 30 minutes later and confessed to several other robberies in the surrounding states as well. On July 31st, Rolling began to serve 2 6-year sentences for the aforementioned armed robberies. While here, Rollings would begin to lift weights and, according to his mother, began to put on size and appeared to be adjusting to prison life. Now, these sentences were to be served concurrent, not consecutively. For those that don't know, let me explain the differences between the two, and how many of Rollings' crimes could likely have been prevented had he served this consecutively. When someone is sentenced for more than one crime, there are 2 ways they can serve it: concurrently, meaning both sentences run together, or consecutively, meaning one sentence does not begin being served until the other is complete. Here's what that means using Rollings as an example. Had his time been served consecutively, he would have served a total of 12 years for his crimes, keeping him locked up until July 31st of 1991. Keep that date in mind as we move further into Rolling's crimes. In this case, the judge thought with Rolling's numerous crimes that he should be released to the public after only 6 years. He was allowed to serve his sentence concurrently, so he began and ended both 6-year sentences together. This is a weakness in the justice system that is overused in sentencing and often allows violent criminals to be released back into the public years and sometimes decades earlier than they would have been held otherwise. In some cases, this results in carnage and loss of life that could have otherwise been entirely avoided, as we're soon to find out. Rollings would make several escape attempts over the next several years, with the first starting just after his first imprisonment. On October 8th of 1979, Rollings ran off from a road gang while they were chopping down trees. He surrendered about 100 yards from the prison's boundaries after an officer fired a warning shot. He would be caught trying to escape again after being sent to Montgomery County Jail to stand trial for an earlier robbery attempted there. Despite his convictions and pending robbery charges, as well as 2 escape attempts, Rollings was now considered reliable enough to become a jail trustee, somehow. A trustee is a person considered low risk, who generally has minor charges and a small sentence as they are considered less likely to escape. Trustees get the ability to go to secure or low security areas of the jail and are rarely supervised heavily. While in this role, Rollings escapes, what a shock, and would actually be able to flee the state of Alabama before being captured again in Louisiana. It is unknown if any of these escapes, which are criminal charges, resulted in him getting additional time added to his sentence. If it had, in addition to a consecutive sentence, who knows how many of Rollings' later crimes could have been prevented. Failing after failing of the justice system, who seemingly is doing everything they can to keep Rollings in society. This is, keep in mind, despite police's best efforts at catching a serial robber and building a great case against him that led to a conviction. Rollings would be released early from prison, coming home to Shreveport June 7, 1984. This is extremely angering, as Rollings did everything he could to have time added to his already weak sentence, and yet he was still released a year early. Just several months later in November, Rollings commits his first break-in to a young woman's home. He claimed he wanted to rape her, but felt bad when he saw her crying. He claims that they hung out and talked for several hours before having consensual sex. He then flees the area, fearing that she would call the police. It is unknown who this victim is, or even if this account is true or totally fabricated, and no known victim of this incident actually exists. If it is true, it shows the beginnings of a disturbing trend for Rollings. On July 22, 1985, Rollings would go back to his old ways, robbing a Kroger store for $200 and stealing a family member's car the next day. He was arrested, and on March 20th, 1986, would be sentenced to 4 years after pleading guilty. Now you may be wondering why he got such a relatively light sentence despite his history. It is very likely Rollings took a plea deal here, and was offered a light sentence to avoid a trial. If he had been given a proper sentence given his history and pattern of reoffending, it's likely he would have gotten an additional 10 or more years in prison here, meaning these murders would never have happened, at least when they did. On March 15, 1986, Rollings would escape by simply walking away from the prison and swimming in a river. It's disgusting that this keeps happening despite his well-known escape history. But fortunately, as far as we know, he did not commit any crimes while he was escaped, and was caught a short time later. Now we've gone over his very extensive criminal history at this point, so you'd think that despite his already weak sentence, he would at least have to stay for the 4 years he was sentenced to, right? Guess again. On July 19, 1988, just 2 years into his sentence, Rollings was paroled under the condition he returned to his hometown of Shreveport. While home, Rollings would eventually take a job working at Poncho's restaurant, but would be fired on November 4th of 1989. According to Rollings' boss, he had missed 3 days of work, and when he was confronted about it, Rollings threatened to kill him and the cook in a fit of rage. Just 2 days later, 3 bodies would be found. After all the warning signs, missed chances, and weak sentences, the murders would finally begin. November 6, 1989. The bodies of 24-year-old Julie Grissom, father William Tom Grissom, and her 8-year-old nephew, Sean Grissom, would be discovered in their Shreveport home. Sean had only been visiting his grandfather and aunt for the weekend and was supposed to return home November 6th. When he didn't, his mother called the police, who along with several neighbors would discover the first of 3 bodies that morning. What follows is a very graphic description of the crimes, so please be warned. William's body was the first to be discovered, with several stab wounds to his back and chest. Sean was the next to be found, and was discovered to have been stabbed just once in the back. This stab was so forceful and violent that the knife had entered through his back and exited through his chest. In line with the cowardly nature of Danny Rolling, it was determined that he had snuck up on Sean and killed him while Sean was watching TV. The worst discovery was yet to come. In the master bedroom, Julie was discovered. She had been stabbed several times, but unlike Sean or William, she was nude, and her body had been cleaned with vinegar. Worse still, she had been posed on the bed with her legs spread, meant to be seen by whoever would first discover her. Police would do their best to solve the murders, but because of the delay in discovering the victims, as well as the fact that Rollings had cleaned the crime scene, it would go cold. Little did the police know, the killer lived just 10 minutes away. December 24th, 1989, Christmas Eve. Rollings, after a fight with his father, would wander the neighborhood. Eventually, he claims to have broken into the home of a neighborhood woman he had been watching for some time. For an unknown reason, she did not return home that night, something that certainly saved her life. After waiting for several hours, Rollings would steal some money, alcohol, and a revolver before leaving the house. May 18th, 1990. The event that would ultimately lead Rollings to Florida. After getting into yet another heated argument with his father, Rollings had had enough. After everything he suffered at the hands of his father James, Rollings would use the revolver he had stolen several months prior, shooting James in the stomach and forehead. Despite the severity of his injuries, James would actually survive this, but would permanently lose the use of one eye and one ear. After this, Rollings fled, committing several small robberies to cover the cost of bus fare. At this point, he was once again a wanted man and was facing significant jail time. However, we see yet another limitation of the time, specifically being a lack of communication between departments, especially in different states. But Rollings would also do something else that would allow him to remain a free man for just a little while longer and help to avoid detection. On June 2nd, 1990, he would break into the home of Michael Kennedy Jr., who was deceased. Due to an apparent similarity in appearance, Rollings would have success in using this ID for himself. Now on the run, and with his crimes reaching newer, more violent peaks, Rollings would return to his old familiar ways of making money. On June 12th, he robbed a Westwood United store, managing to take $1,661 in U.S. currency. According to witnesses, he thanked the clerk and witnesses repeatedly, saying, "Thank you, God bless, please pray for me, God knows I need it." On June 30th, he returned again for a second robbery, this time getting away with just over $2,000 from the same business. All this time, Rollings was living in the woods in the Gainesville area, in a tent. While here, he would call home and describe how he was hiding out in the woods and how the cops would never be able to find him. It would later be discovered that his tent was less than 2 miles from the scene of every murder he would commit. Before the murders, however, Rollings would steal a car, committing more robberies and burglaries in the Central Florida area. This is very frustrating, knowing that had he been caught at this point, there was a chance the murders may never have happened. Of course, he probably would have just gotten another plea deal and early release, so who knows? Either way, it shows the limitations of police work during the time. Even today, it is much harder to make an arrest in most cases where the suspect is unknown, and that was even more so true during this time. Using a stolen car for most of his crimes, an alias, and moving around the entire state of Florida while committing these crimes, it's easy to see how he would have gotten away with it, especially not being known to local authorities. But this was about to get much worse than just property crimes. On August 24th of 1990, the Gainesville Ripper would emerge. In the late hours of the night, Rollings would break into an apartment shared by 2 University of Florida freshmen, 18-year-old Sonja Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell. Rollings came upon Powell while she was sleeping on a couch downstairs. During this time, he claims he stood over her, but instead of attacking, decided to go upstairs instead. Here, he discovered Larson, taping her mouth shut before waking her to keep her quiet. Evidence on the scene would later show that Larson had tried to fight for her life with everything she had, but she would ultimately be unable to stop the much larger Rollings, and she was stabbed multiple times until she died. Rollings then went back downstairs, using the same method of taping Powell's mouth shut before sexually battering her. Once Rollings was done, he stabbed Powell 5 times in the back, killing her. Just as he had done to Julie in Shreveport, he would pose both girls in a sexual position, even showering before he left. August 25th, 1990. Just 1 day later, Rollings broke into the apartment of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, an honors student at Santa Fe College. When he discovered she was not home, he waited for Hoyt to return. At 11 a.m., when Hoyt returned home, she was tackled and choked into unconsciousness, where she was then restrained and later sexually battered. Just like he had done the day before, Rollings the coward stabbed Hoyt in the back, severing an artery and killing her. Once this was done, he turned her over and sliced her open from her pubic bone to her breastbone, leaving her mutilated body on display. Incredibly enough, he left and once back at his campsite, decided to return to the murder scene, fearing that he had left his wallet there. Once he was back, he apparently decided he had not victimized Hoyt enough, choosing to decapitate her and placing her body in an upright sitting position on her bed and placing her head on a shelf, forcing her to look at her own body. Rollings was truly a coward who could not even allow his victims to have dignity in death. After 3 murders in 2 days, the local area was terrified. Most college students actually began to have mass sleepovers. Many would even choose to withdraw from their attendance and enroll in another school altogether. The numbers vary, but the highest estimate I saw was that 700 students decided in that first semester to withdraw and go to another school entirely. Not everyone would take these precautions, however, as we will unfortunately see. August 27th, 1990. 23-year-old Tracy Paulez and her roommate, 23-year-old Manny Traboda, were the next to fall victim to Rollings. As he had done in all the other murders, Rollings made entry into the apartment by prying open the sliding glass doors with a screwdriver. He would come across a sleeping Manny and killed him after a brief struggle. Upon hearing this struggle, Paulez ran to Manny's room, and upon seeing Rollings standing over Manny's body, ran to her bedroom and tried to barricade herself inside. Rollings would use his size to his advantage and force entry through the door. Here we see him sticking to his same MO, or modus operandi, Latin for method of operating. As we've described previously, this is a phrase used by law enforcement to describe how a criminal operates, to try and link a killer or criminal to their crimes. Rawlings would bind Paula's hands and tape her mouth shut, cutting off her clothing and sexually battering her. Again, Rawlings would stab Paula's in the back 3 times, killing her and posing her body. In just under 5 days, 5 college students had been murdered brutally in their homes. The hunt for the Gainesville Ripper had just begun. With the exception of Manny, William, and Sean, each of Rawlings' female victims had been petite white brunettes, apparently just as his own mother had been. One suspect in the case was Edward Lewis Humphrey, a University of Florida student who had a history of mental illness and bore numerous scars on his face from a car accident. Humphrey was identified early on as a possible suspect in the case, and would eventually be arrested after a physical altercation with his grandmother and held in custody for 5 months, until a grand jury released him, citing insufficient evidence. However, the damage had been done. His photo was shown repeatedly by media outlets as the possible killer. Authorities would not publicly clear him of all charges until after Rawlings' arrest. We could do an entire video just on the topic of Edward, but I'll try to briefly describe it here so you can see how he became a prime suspect in the case for law enforcement. Edward Humphrey's name did not just fall out of the sky into the lap of law enforcement. His name was given as a suspect by numerous people to police for the killings. Look again at his mugshot and you'll notice the numerous scars on his face that give him a pretty frightening appearance, apparently caused by a bad car crash some years earlier. Additionally, Humphrey was not taking his prescribed medications for his manic depressive disorder, and had just recently been arrested for a domestic battery against his grandmother. Apparently, his grandmother insisted that Humphrey had not hit her and wanted him released from jail. This is not actually uncommon at all in cases of domestic violence. In many cases, from personal experience, the victim will lie as they didn't actually want the perpetrator to go to jail when they called the police. Unfortunately, around this time was when some departments began to mandate that an arrest be made in cases of domestic violence. Police would secure a search warrant on Humphrey's home and discovered numerous magazines depicting knives, guns, and women. An honestly not too uncommon possession for a 19-year-old. There were also instances of circumstantial evidence at the time that, due to technological limitations, could neither clearly exonerate or condemn Humphrey. For instance, several hairs and fibers found on the scene were similar in appearance and makeup to Humphrey, but they could not be conclusively linked to him. However, investigators were able to determine that the semen left on multiple crime scenes belonged to someone with blood type B, but Humphrey had type A. Despite this, he was still brought before a grand jury, and thankfully, the jury refused to formally bring charges against him. Interestingly enough, the same day police began to surveil Humphrey, they discovered Rawlings' campsite. They also discovered Rawlings and one other male there, a Mr. Tony Danzy. Tony stayed on scene, and Rawlings fled. However, police discovered several items, such as a handgun, a guitar, a tape recorder, and a large sum of money with red dye all over it. But for unknown reasons, investigators never checked the tape. This was likely because this incident was initially linked to a robbery, and the hunt for the killer included no knowledge of a robbery. But had investigators listened to it, they would have heard recordings of Rawlings singing about himself, calling himself a drifter, a murderer, someone who had lost his mind, and even at one point, mentioning himself using his full name. The reasons this would have been a huge investigative lead is because around the same time, an old acquaintance of Rawlings was traveling through Florida when she heard about the murders. Cindy Juricic was traveling in Florida in late August of 1990, and upon hearing about a string of murders where the victims were sexually battered and stabbed, she strangely said that she immediately thought of Danny Rawlings. The murders were very similar to the ones discussed earlier in Shreveport, where Cindy also lived. Cindy recalled a rush in memory in that moment, thinking back to the nights Rawlings, who was a friend of theirs, would come over and tell Cindy and her husband one night that he had to go, referring to a sudden departure. After he left, Cindy was later told by her husband that Rawlings had confided in him that he had had a problem, and that problem was that he'd like to stick knives into people. At the time, Cindy dismissed it, not wanting to believe that it could mean Rawlings was responsible for the horrific Shreveport murders. But after hearing about the college student murders, she now called Crime Stoppers and gave his name as a tip. Now I want to take a minute and stress just how difficult this investigation was to handle during this time. Crimes of this magnitude were rare, and many departments did not have the training or manpower to effectively investigate every lead. This led both the Gainesville Police Department and the Alachua County Sheriff's Office to call in help from all around the entire state. Despite this, police were absolutely flooded with calls, having hundreds of different names given to them in a short span of time as the possible killer, and they would either have had to thoroughly investigate each and every one, or just the ones that had the highest likelihood of being connected, such as Humphrey. Now for those of you who watched my video on Ted Bundy, you'll notice that for a good while Bundy seemed to be able to come and go freely without leaving a trace or being seen, almost like a ghost. In these murders, Rawlings seemed to have almost the same ability. But investigators would note that each one of these murders happened at a house that was very near or bordered by a thick wood line, allowing the killer to come and go undercover. The day of Hoyt's murder, police also responded to a robbery at a bank just a half-mile away from her home, and would later discover Rawlings' campsite like we discussed earlier. One of the key pieces discovered at the campsite was a screwdriver. In and of itself not unusual, but considering the MO of the killer and how they made entry, it's shocking that this was not connected for several months. But thankfully, Rawlings would soon be caught, but not for the murders just yet. September 8th, 1990. Rawlings steals another car and commits an armed robbery at a Winn-Dixie in Ocala, having fled the Gainesville area days after having been chased by police in the woods. During this robbery, Rawlings missed an employee in the back office, who was able to call police and report it. Police would arrive just as Rawlings was driving off, and a pursuit began, ultimately ending when Rawlings crashed his car and was taken into custody after a short foot chase. In November of 1991, Rawlings would receive a conviction after having been charged for a felony fleeing and eluding, armed robbery, possession of a stolen vehicle, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and being linked and found guilty of committing 3 burglaries in Tampa. This, along with his record, led to an absolutely astonishing prison sentence, one that if it had been given earlier would have prevented all of the killings and crimes committed by this true maniac. Rawlings would be sentenced to 3 life sentences plus 170 years. And to think, this was before Florida enacted the 3 strikes law. Danny Rawlings' life was over before it was ever even known he was the Gainesville Ripper. Authorities would finally catch up to Rawlings, and he would be connected to the murders once officers finally listened to that recording found at his campsite. After receiving yet another life sentence for the armed robbery of the Union Bank, Rawlings made several attempts to end his life in prison and was moved to the psych ward. While here, Rawlings would confide about his crimes to a death row inmate named Bobby Lewis. Rawlings would confess to the 5 murders in an unorthodox interrogation, where Lewis would speak for Rawlings, and Rawlings would confirm what was said to him by investigators. During this time, Rawlings refused to admit to the Shreveport murders, which in my opinion is because he did not want to be known as a child killer while in prison. Oddly enough, Rawlings would claim to have 2 different personalities, one named Yanad, or Danny spelt backwards, and the other named Gemini. Rawlings attributed the worst of his crimes to this Gemini personality, which psychologists would later claim was his attempt at distancing himself from the worst acts he had committed. Investigators also had Rawlings take all the credit for the murders, to once and for all clear Humphrey from having any involvement. Rawlings, despite his numerous life sentences, would finally stand responsible for taking those 5 innocent lives in February of 1994, 4 years later. Rawlings pled guilty on all counts, but because this was a death penalty case, the trial still had to play out in order for the jury to make the recommendation of death. Prosecutors also attacked his claim of having a split personality called Gemini, which was responsible for the crimes, claiming he based this on a character from the movie Exorcist III. Ultimately, Rawlings was given 5 death sentences. The severity of this trial and the emotions of all the victims' families did not stop Rawlings from making a spectacle of himself. After his arrest, he began a relationship with Sandra London, who you may remember as the same woman who had dated another incarcerated serial killer in one of my previous videos. During his trial, Rawlings actually sang a song of his own creation to Sandra, which was an incredibly awkward experience for all involved. Let's take a look at it so you can suffer along with me.
You have anything you want to say, Mr. Rawlings? Well, sir. If it please the court, could I address the court? Sure, say whatever you want to say. Thank you. Anytime. I recall the day I first saw you. I reached out to say I love you, but it was hard to say. I couldn't touch you. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together. Excuse me, Mr. Rawlings. Down the path you choose to follow. Mr. Rawlings. So tell me, baby, what were my words? All my tears run together. What were my words? All my tears run together, baby, just like rain. I say, yeah.
Pretty bad, right? Between Rawlings, Ted Bundy, and Gerard Schaefer in my prior videos, serial killers seem like a romantic bunch once they're locked up. October 25th, 2006. Danny Rawlings would be put to death on this day by lethal injection. Prior to his death, he spoke to the pastor at his local church and handed him a note. This note was Rawlings' final confession, where he finally admitted to the Shreveport murders. According to investigators, this was never in question. It was just a waiting game, and they believe that Rawlings may have confessed when he did to try and extend the date of his execution with another trial. Unfortunately for Rawlings, investigators and prosecutors in both Florida and Louisiana agreed that Rawlings would die faster if left in Florida, and the one thing everyone wanted more than anything was Rawlings dead. His last meal was lobster tail, and he sang a gospel hymn as his last statement, not giving any apology or any other words whatsoever before leaving this world for the next. And that brings us to the end of this video. I'm sorry for such a long gap in between uploads, but I was on my honeymoon and did not want to cover such depressing topics during it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. We will have a few more coming, but I will be starting a new series soon that I think you guys will really like, and that will address some more modern day issues. If you like what you see, feel free to check out my catalog and previous videos, and subscribe if you want to see more. I should have another video up for you guys in the next week or two. In the meantime, stay safe and stay tuned.